graduated in 2014, and he went off to work in England for a while on conservation carpentry with Owlsworth IJP, right?
Yep.
That's correct.
Yep.
On working heritage sites, so windmills and the kind of issues that come up with working heritage sites and the practical issues that you have to deal with in working heritage sites and replacement parts and that sort of thing. So he has quite the background and thinks about conservation quite a bit, so he'll be a great moderator for this panel.
Thanks everyone. It's wonderful to be back. It's been a while since I've been here, and it's so cool to be back in this room. My class that came in, we hadn't actually acquired the Laura Secord campus quite yet, so we actually spent a lot of time in here, especially for lunchtime and debates, and aside from the classroom time. So this room itself is just sort of is so important to all Willowbank students. So I'm really excited to see how this whole day turns out, and hopefully we have some really positive feedback and some good ideas with what to do with it. So gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much and for being here. And I guess, Joe, we're starting with you. Is that fair? Yeah. Sure. So I'll just give a quick bio to everyone for you. Do that. Yeah, very quick. And just so you know, I'm sure you guys have yourselves time, but obviously we're sort of constrained by time today as well to get everybody in. So very kindly, at about 10 minutes, I'll just show say that you've got about a 5-minute mark, total 15 minutes, just to keep everything sort of in order. But anyway, sorry, I didn't actually memorize this, so I'm just going to read.
You don't need to say anything. You could just get your timer going.
Are you sure? Sure. Yeah. What do you think, Crystal?
You've got some
push on.
You don't need
just say where he comes from.
Okay. So where are you?
That city north of here.
Yes, that's right. That big city just on the lake. Yeah. So Joe, he works for DTAH, or he's your partner at DTAH Architects. He's worked on some amazing stuff downtown Toronto, Witchwood Barns, Evergreen Brickworks. I guess very, very interested in design or adaptive reuse and how to basically work with existing buildings and kind of add a modern twist to them. So cool. Joe, please.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm not. I really enjoyed that first presentation. Thank you. As I said to you, I didn't find it menacing enough, but lots of similar feelings. A couple of things occur to me. One is that Willowbank should never use the moniker museum or house museum as it moves forward, and I think that may come through in some of the remarks I'll make. And I think I'm going to sort of come at this topic of what I appreciate is ultimately a discussion about a room adaptation from a much kind of broader perspective of the experience I've had. This is an image created by my wife a few years after meeting me. And she made 3 of these for 3 of us who came together in architectural practice about 35 years ago, a long time ago. And whatever it says to me or whatever I have to share on this bit of the room today, I think I want to pass on 2 book recommendations, and I have a top 10 list. So there's at least something. I was trying to figure out how I could help with this conversation you're having. The first book recommendation is at the beginning, and there's one at the end, is a book that I remember well when I was younger, called Collage City by Colin Rowe and Fred Cotter. And is an idea about an emerging city that has many voices and many different kind of layers and presences to it. When I was in university graduating, some of you know I tried to do an adaptive reuse project for my thesis project, and it was declined on the basis that it was not an appropriate topic for discussion in a university setting. I went to high school in Niagara Falls, ended up back there after university, and sure enough, the first project I ever got involved in was the adaptive reuse of the Oneida Observation Tower overlooking Niagara Falls, built in 1962. by a wonderful Toronto engineer. I got to meet William Sefton, and a development company had bought it to turn it into a sort of retail-themed place. It's the place I met my wife, actually. But and this is what it looks like now. This is not the way we left it. And I come to it because it sort of, I think, had 3 lives, maybe 4, since the 1960s. And it speaks to the time. I graduated in the late 90s, or late 70s, excuse me. Sorry, I know. But Canada's buildings have sort of come of an age, and there have been a lot of remakes of a lot of things. This is a Jane Jacobs quote that I know can be interpreted in a number of ways, but a couple of ways that I would sort of speak to it is when I graduated, 20% of the Canadian construction economy was dedicated to adaptive reuse. Now 50 to 60% of the Canadian construction economy is dedicated that way. Most of the architects, most of the work architects will do over the next 50 years in both the United States and Canada will be on buildings that already exist. The only way we're going to impact climate change is by dealing with buildings that exist. It's not about new buildings. So we have a lot of work to do, and this conversation you're having about a room is part of a larger context, and it's about a living culture, and that's, I think, a key thing. So in this 3 to 4 decades of time that I've now been working as an architect, it just turns out that a lot of buildings needed to be remade, reborn, adapted. They went out of use, they transformed use. And in many cases, they changed ownership and they changed use, and therefore they needed to provide more amenity. They needed to still provide life, but they needed to be remade in lots of different ways. And sometimes the project on the top is the first legal live-work building in Ontario, done in '94 for Toronto Artscape, and it was just a basic warehouse with one facade on it and sort of dumb sides, and a cornice that was literally falling off. And it had a great wood structure, but candidly beyond that it didn't have much, and we had $54 a square foot, which even in 1994 was not very much money to put this back together. And so off-the-shelf parts for cornice, porches that get added on, saddlebag balconies, a lobby that takes on an industrial aesthetic that was never actually there, but could be imagined to be within and behind that facade, that gave it a living life for artists to use it in an adaptable fashion and kind of take it from there. Or churches, the Riverdale Presbyterian Church that sold its main nave because the numbers were down, took over the Sunday school at the north end, wanted to bring it back to life, but not a very friendly building, not very welcoming, certainly not accessible, but so therefore needing to adapt, needing additions, needing something to make it more welcoming and more gracious, more bright, more open again to deal with a new population, or for L'Arche, the adaptation of a Baptist church into a new gathering place, L'Arche being an organization that takes people with disabilities and welcomes them back into communities. And so, you know, the old baptismal font being a giant focus of a Baptist church, but that not being relevant, but nevertheless working with those elements and then adding new elements that provide a new layer of presence and meaning and reflect a new life, whatever that might mean for the building, is most of what I ended up doing. Sometimes we're trying to add character to buildings that don't in fact have enough character. Or something like this, the Little Trinity, a project for Little Trinity Church in Toronto, where there was a facade left that you can see here, but behind it, it was literally crumbling, like literally, you know, extremely dangerous, had been abandoned for decades. And the church wanted it to come back, and a new building emerging out of a new. So it's the idea here of a living culture, and that this all is about bringing new life to old things. It's the Jane Jacobs quote, and these two projects that were mentioned, the adaptive reuse of a brickworks facility, 12 acres, and a 5-acre transit barn in Toronto, that were quite wonderful to be part of, but involved huge amounts of people, community interests, ranges of perspective, pools of money, ideas, having to come together and make something new of these old industrial places, and therefore that sense of preciousness had to be put aside. There was absolutely a sense of respect, but there was a kind of getting at it so that you could honor and respect a kind of past life that happened in these buildings, but absolutely adapt them to bring new life to them. Sorry, let me go back to that one. Is this right? Let me, okay. That, okay. Sorry. In the Brickworks project, we had a large team of people, we had a lot of places, and we had an opportunity to explore the various strategies that one might assume in dealing with the transformation of a place, bringing new life and new things to it, but respecting old things. And so there were lots of explorations of different ways to do things. Claude Cormier, one member of our team, brought this image from a French artist of a fairly obvious kind of old, beautiful chair, adapted in some fashion. Something new added to it, something else then added to it, changing its use, changing its perspective, changing its character, but the thing that began remains present in some fashion in it. And so that was an attitude we had as we approached projects like the Brickworks, where there had to be a kind of a room for a lot of community life. Nevertheless, in some cases, this is building 14 at the Brickworks, where more or less all we had left was a skeleton, a basic steel frame. There was an old skin on it, but it was sort of crumbling, and there wasn't much left to it. Nevertheless, we clung to that skeleton. And in this image here, you can see this steel column that supports a steel truss, which we kept in place all the way through and kept the structure, but effectively reclad it, but wanted to celebrate that structure and add a kind of new structure to it as we went along. And sorry about that. So that when you go inside that building, there's a layering of coloring, where gray steel in the ceiling is new steel that is sort of providing lateral bracing and stability to a structure that otherwise was a little wonky. And the red steel that remains is unpainted, it's just sealed, cleaned, and left alone. And that kind of layering is left to remain. And there are other layers that are added in to give the place life. The point about graffiti, for example, there was the Brickworks had been abandoned for 15 years. Graffiti artists were getting in. There were great raves there. It was a photographer's hangout. So that part of history was as relevant, and some people really missed the fact that ever changed. Thank you. I'm going to move on. This impacts the way, certainly, I think we do a lot of work around city building and thinking about the city at large, and this layering at a city level is potentially relevant to a room as well. There was a time in Toronto, this was the building removed to make way for Mies van der Rohe's TD Pavilion, with nary a whimper, by the way, at this point in time, and this was Toronto's 1967 Centennial Project. That gave way to a preservation movement from which, Ontario's come a long way. Victoria College is one of my favorite places in Toronto, because there is this layering over more than a century of different stewards of the place bringing their own buildings to it and enriching a place without destroying what was there before, but modifying it and adding layers to the place. So that's a kind of idea of a city that I want to be part of, and that I think that can be part of a way of thinking about buildings and rooms. Places like the distillery, the ballet school. One of my favorite places in Germany brings to mind a couple of things about a room like this. This is Landschaftspark in Duisburg at the confluence of the Ruhr and Rhine, where they took an old industrial building and turned it into an incredible cultural park. Lighting and mechanical systems. Putting a lot of people into this room, things like fresh air, things like lighting that could be sort of present or not present. All of these kinds of things add dimension and layers to the life of things. This is at Landschaftspark, this kind of lightness of willingness to bring new life to an old place. So I'm going to end now with the top 10 list. One of my favorite places in Toronto, a lot of people's, Nathan Phillips Square, a place result of an international design competition, Scandinavian design, very modern, old City Hall in the background, a range of buildings now around, and within the last 2 to 3 years, Nathan Phillips Square renovated, and even now new elements like that, and that sign in the distance coming in as a result of the Pan Am Games and that sort of thing. So in the context of this kind of layered place and layered thinking, and this list, by the way, I provided at a conference in Calgary this year on the National Trust, where I was asked to speak to the topic of heritage in a design project. Creative straitjacket or creative muse, I think was the way they phrased it. And this was the response. Understand that the new can invigorate the old. Respect what has come before and leave room for what is to come. Combine the skill of an editor with that of a composer. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Respect the dynamic nature of a great place, ever-changing. Light touch, loose fit. The use part of adaptive reuse is subject to change. Remember that. Diversity, our strength. Place more emphasis on the management of change than its regulation and restriction. Be humble, be bold. And my last book recommendation, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, Robert Venturi. Again, when I was a young man, it was very influential in giving me a kind of more richly layered thinking about place. And best wishes with your work on the room. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Joe. So, which one do you guys want to go first? Clinton? Okay, Clinton, go first. So just a brief intro. So Clinton is a widely recognized leader in the historic preservation, architecture, and community revitalization and in public policy. He brings over 30 years of experience to his work of collaboratively creating new value in heritage buildings and places, closely focusing on each of the firm's projects. He earned a BA in sociology from Franklin and Marshall College, interned at the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies, and earned his master's architecture from the University of Virginia. Clinton is a heritage preservation certified CAP building assessor. And 2 secretaries of the Interior appointed him Commissioner of the Erie Canal National Heritage Corridor Commission. The governor appointed him a director of the Richardson Center Corporation Board. He currently serves now on the board for Willowbank School of Restoration Arts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. I just want to acknowledge that today is the anniversary of the Queen Victoria Niagara Falls Park Act, passed in 1887. The park opened in 1888, so it is an auspicious day because we have here in this officially designated heritage corridor this building, and I want to start the process of looking forward for the next generations of this room by looking back at where we started. We're on a site that has been occupied for 8,000 years. I'm not going to describe what happened each year, but I do want to acknowledge that so many of us are guests on a site that has been occupied by Aboriginal First Nations people long before us, who shaped it to some extent, but mostly did not shape it because they lived in harmony in a way that we have not quite figured out yet how to do. The first European to record being here arrived passing this site December 7th, I wasn't there, I have to remember, 1678. So he's 200 years before the Queen Victoria Park Act. That's Father Hennepin, of course, and Coeur LaSalle. LaSalle then built the first ship on the Great Lakes above the falls on what is now the U.S. side, the Griffin. which someday someone will find, probably in Lake Michigan. So this was the first European visit that was recorded, beginning to tell the story of why this house is here, because this was the gateway to the entire continent. Flash forward in 100 years, and we get to the beginning of the reason I am here. I am here to tell you about the United States' approach to what we call historic preservation, and it is completely different than what you were doing at Willowbank. It is what my firm does every day. We're in the business of renewing historic places, renewing historic buildings and places to attract new investment and to create new performance for environmental, equity, and economic reasons. So when we approach something like what you are going to tackle in this room, our first two questions are, who will review a place's alteration, and what does this room need to be? Those are the twin towers, if you will, that are our guidance through the U.S. heritage regime. So let me briefly tell you, 100 years after Father Hennepin arrived, the next three generations created the United States of America and declared independence in 1776. And by 1796, the last British troops left Fort Niagara. And that was a defining moment for a culture that has had a huge impact on all of us since that time. And it is still, though, in light of the 8,000 years of human habitation here, a mere blip. And I point that out because in the United States, we're still figuring out who we are and what we want to be. That's the only way I can explain the current U.S. presidential election. Because I get asked here all the time. We're mere kids. We're still trying to figure it out. And our preservation approach is one of trying to preserve the anchors of our reason for being. The first one being Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It actually started construction somewhere around 1732 and was the site of the Continental Congresses that created the United States after the Declaration of Independence and the winning of the war. But yet by 1816, Philadelphia, which at that time was really the most important city in America, was ready to demolish Independence Hall to accommodate its growth. But cooler heads prevailed and said, this is something that's a place that's very important to us. So by 1831, the city decided not to demolish the building, but rather engaged an architect, including Strickland, who was engaged to restore it to its ancient form. So it's not even 100 years old, it's already an ancient form, but that is the first movement of what in the United States we call historic preservation, restoring to the ancient form. This is reinforced in 1853 when Anne Pamela Cunningham said, I will do it, because George Washington, the revered father of our country, was his house, which really is so iconic, you cannot understand it. It is so latent in the U.S. DNA that, but it was neglected because the new country, then only really 2, maybe 3 generations old, was still figuring out its sense of self, even as all the Europeans were coming over to remake it. She rallied women from across the country at a time when the country was greatly divided between North and South over slavery and states' rights. She said, I will do it, and she created the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So it was women who started the historic preservation movement in the United States by taking responsibility for their heritage. Hence, if it was the men, it might have been heritage, I don't know, but the heritage is what gets me across the border when the U.S. border guards say, what do you do? I'm a heritage consultant, and that doesn't exist in any rule book, so I have to take an anarchist's approach to crossing the border. But Anne Pound Cunningham was probably the most influential historic preservationist to this day, because her approach was the mansion and grounds around it. She wrote to her sisters upon her retirement in 1874, should be religiously guarded from changes, should be kept as Washington left them. And as you heard from Franklin, that's subject to interpretation as to the condition of the house when Washington left it. And in the kitchen, there still exists a fake fire in the fireplace. They're not purists, but they are beginning to try to tell the rest of the story. But the fact that the preservation in its ancient form is the predominant idea still echoes to this day. And we have further developments in the Antiquities Act of 1906, signed by Theodore Roosevelt to protect Indian artifacts that he had seen and others were realizing were threatened in the West. That allowed the president to designate places of importance to America. It was not, it was the beginning of the fight between the rights of a person to own their own property unmolested by the government, which is why the United States was founded, and the United States beginning to realize it had responsibility for its own heritage and those of others. 1906, and then a generation, 2 generations later, 1966, largely out of a realization that urban renewal, as Julian Smith from this podium last Saturday was talking about, modernity, modern architecture, modern uniformity was actually destroying what was so important that we had inherited in the United States. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 created the legal superstructure under which firms like mine operate to this day. And it was really some significant factors that came into play, that there were federal and state roles. We report to the state historic preservation officer so much of my firm's work, our clients' work, and that is the retail level, with the National Park Service being at the sort of larger overseeing level. There's 2 aspects. One is regulatory compliance, and the other are incentives. Regulatory compliance for the use of public funds. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that you would not undertake a project like this in a community like this in the United States without some public money. And the public money comes with this regulatory review to see that you are not destroying something due to your actions. And then incentives in terms of tax incentives. Both of those are related to properties that are officially designated in the National Register of Historic Places. It's the honor roll for buildings and sites. And then finally, the review of the use of public money in a room like this, or tax and other incentives, is done for consistency with the Secretary of the Interior standards. Now this is what the legislation says the Secretary of the Interior standards are: a common sense historic preservation principle in non-technical language to promote preservation best practices that will help to protect our nation's irreplaceable cultural resources. None of that is currently true, but that is what the legislation is. And Franklin gave you great insight into the war that's going on between the current reality and this dead hand of inheritance on what to do with, but I perhaps speak too personally. There are 4 treatments were allowed under the Secretary of Interior's standards for preservation planning. 1, preservation as is. 2, restoration as was. 3, reconstruction as was, or rehabilitation. That's retaining and repairing existing features while adding new utility. And that's where, for us, the money is. Preservation is the maintenance and repair of existing historic materials. And these are important criteria by which your work in this room would be judged if it were to occur in the United States. Either if this were a public building, or if you were receiving public money going into it. And there are some examples of magnificent tourist destinations that reflect that preservation. Restoration is undertaken to depict a property at a particular period of time in its history, often its first building, its first arrival on the scene. And then reconstruction, we see this at Fort George, where I grew up hanging out, that recreates vanished or non-surviving portions of a property for interpretive purposes. Actually, the Darwin Martin House in Buffalo is the best illustration in North America, I think, at all 4 approaches on one site. Finally, rehabilitation. This acknowledges the need to alter or add to a historic property to meet continuing or changed uses while retaining the property's historic character. This is a one-time automobile garage and maintenance facility that was converted into a home for the blind and visually impaired. Now, the Secretary of Interior standards are 10 standards said to be guidelines for determining the appropriate alteration to an historic place. And I put the actual illustration from the National Park Service website of an early Willowbank student working on a heritage building that the U.S. National Park Service uses to illustrate its intent for employing future Willowbank graduates at maintaining historic sites in the U.S. A property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and its environment. So if you, as we were Thursday, spending hours trying to figure out how to get tax credits to convert a abandoned knitting mill into the National Women's Hall of Fame Center for Great Women, how does this standard apply? This is the rub and the discussion we always have on all of our projects. Because from the point of view of the U.S. federal government, keeping a building in its current use is the highest and best use of that building. So the approach for the reviewer is always, if you're going to change this room, you are violating the first commandment. And that is always very tricky to do. The historic character of a property should be retained and preserved. This is the second priority. The removal of historic materials or alteration shall be avoided. Each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. So dealing with a building that's had multiple uses before you got to it really makes it a very difficult negotiation. And we went through that with this National Women's Hall of Fame, where the Park Service, in doing what we would call a pre-Part 2, would not give us written authorization to demolish anything, even though some of the buildings are already on the ground. They would not put in writing, it is okay to remove the demolished buildings. This is very, very challenging. And so one of the important things in going through this room would be having documentation of every decision, every element of the room. That would help you make your case before the National Park Service as to how you go forward. Most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. This trips up amateurs who want tax credits. They buy a retail building built in the 1880s to the turn of the last century, but sometime in its history, more than 50 years ago, 50 years is our threshold for history, somebody added Carrera glass to the storefront and altered to make the front door deeper, which was the Raymond Loewy theory of attracting people into the building by having them walk by the show windows. They say, well, that's not historic, we're taking that out. They don't get the tax credits because those two changes are more than 50 years old, so they have accrued their own history over time. And as soon as they remove the Carrera glass, they run afoul of that standard 4. Distinctive features shall be preserved. Retain and repair is the mantra. And then replace in kind is the headline for number 6. Number 7, this would seem obvious. It's the physician's first to do no harm. Chemical or physical treatment such as sandblasting. This is directly in there because some of us might go back to the first days of historic preservation when the first thing you do is sandblast all the paint off the brick. And you replace the multi-pane sashes with single panes of glass, the Orphan Annie effect. We still see in Philadelphia, where a lot of this started, and other cities, the Orphan Annies with acne skin. That was the birth of preservation, and this standard was written to stop that practice. Significant archaeological resources. If you were to work outside this building, the first thing you do is an archaeological survey, but you always remember that the archaeologists are happiest when stuff remains buried. And if you assure them whatever is under there is going to stay there, you're going to get your approvals and move forward. New additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials. And as long as you can't tell it's an addition, you're going to get approval. The theory is that nobody today can do as good a job as the person who first worked on the building. And therefore, if you're going to add to the building, you have to defer to the original building. This is always a big issue. And then finally, additions shall be undertaken in such a manner that they can be removed. This is called reversibility. Number 9, the nickname is false historicity. We like false historicity. Originally this said, when it was first written, no false historicity. Number 10 is reversibility. In other words, we can never do as well as our grandparents did. So that's a personal view of the Secretary of the Interior standards. Now let's talk about how we would look at this room. And I've got several scenarios to think about. There is no review by anybody else because you're doing your work on your own building with your own money, except I want to make sure we defer to our masters, the Ontario Heritage Trust, which has an agreement for Willowbank's treatment of this facility. So I don't want them to think they're being dishonored by some of the things I'm going to show you. We would have under the National Historic Preservation Act a Section 106 review for consistency with the Interior Standards, Secretary of Interior Standards, or in New York State what we call a 1409 review, or an historic tax credit review. But all of them would start with the period of significance. And the period of significance is what is the span of time during which significant events and activities occurred. So we now have, say, in the Darwin Martin house, a period of significance when the Martins lived there. A beginning date, an end date, Frank Lloyd Wright is engaged, and Mr. Martin dies, and they have to abandon the house because they ran out of money. What is our period of significance in this house? So one of the first discussions for this room is that are we in a Hamilton house or are we in a Bright house? This is why some of these things are very, very interesting and thought-provoking, because that's going to be the discussion about whose room we're in right now. We look at the house and the setting. I think the National Park Service would tip toward a Hamilton interpretation because the house and the setting are relatively still reflective of the Hamilton period. And then in terms of the issue of contemporary historic layers, in a country that's only 220 or 230 years old and has still hasn't figured out who it is and what it wants to be, there are not many layers in US buildings as there are in Asian, Indian, or European buildings. So this is a very, very, in all due respect, this is a very, very difficult issue for anybody working on trying to keep a 200-year-old, a 100-year-old, or a 60-year-old building alive, because it has to have an economic purpose in order to stay alive in America. We don't do house museums anymore for some good reasons. So we don't have many examples of adding contemporary layers and respecting them. We have the Carrera glass issue. Who would know amongst my mother's generation that Carrera glass would be an historic material? So this is a challenge for reviewers who are not trained at Willowbank. And this is a plug for Willowbank's being the center of working these ideas out in a world that needs them. And so I want to end with a matrix that I would propose you think about as you think about the next steps of what happens to this room. So if we look across the top, we have a description of the existing conditions, the proposed new use or approach, the theme that might be illustrating, the treatment approach, and this is what we talk about in the United States. We talk about how are we treating the historic resource, and the stakeholders who might be involved during the various approaches. So I describe what we have as a palimpsest. People know what a palimpsest is? It's an unpronounceable word for a very simple idea. It's a piece of vellum on which there was writing that over the ages has been scraped off and rewritten over. Another way to think about it is a heritage gestalt. You've all seen those gestalt diagrams. Is it 2 vases, or is it 2 faces, or 1 vase or 2 faces? We have a room that's like that, don't we? And so understanding what we have and describing it in a way that develops consensus, I think, is the first part. So that's the headline. We have a palimpsest, we have a heritage gestalt as a starting point. So getting consensus about what that means, I think, is part of the methodology of dealing with this room's future. So what is the proposed new use? Well, we have an historic house museum. We have a National Historic Site, the highest designation, important nationally in a country that's more provincial in the best sense of the word than national, as opposed to the US. And what would the theme be? Well, maybe the Hamilton House Museum and Event Center, where someone would come here to learn about the life on the frontier in the 100 years after Hennepin arrived. And it's also a great place to have weddings and parties. So what would be the treatment approach? It would be a restoration, not a rehabilitation, but it would involve reconstruction and some preservation of the Hamilton period of significance. And the Ontario Heritage Trust would probably buy into that. If there were public funding in the United States, and I don't know the regime in Canada or Ontario, there would be a stakeholder that you're answering to in the use of the public money that you don't get unless you get a no adverse effect letter. How about if we look at a proposed new use as an historic house museum, a National Historic Site, and the Bright Mansion Museum and Event Center. Certainly the Bright family, who didn't live here as long as the Hamiltons, but did leave their mark and contributed to Canada and its growth certainly here as much as perhaps the Hamiltons did in so many ways. And there again, you would have the same situation of restoration to a Hamilton period of significance, and you'd be telling the story of the 20th century, not the story of the 19th century. How about if it is a school, an educational workshop and teaching tool? I think of this place as being like a medical student's cadaver. We have spread out on the table something that is certainly visible on the outside, as most of us generally are each day, but it's also opened up and its insides are revealed in a way that a cadaver is, and this is used in the other buildings as sort of a teaching tool for Willowbank students, much like a cadaver would be used as a teaching tool for medical students. Well, here you might look at preservation as is. A fellow board member said, nothing's ever finished at Willowbank. And some of us looked around and said, well, that's okay. Others of us, and some of our funders said, I agree, that's not okay. We have to get to a point of finish, and that's part of what's driving this whole issue. What is the finish of this room as we go forward? Finally, what if it is a Willowbank School, National Historic Site, and Center for Cultural Landscape? We would have perhaps the existing condition of a rehabilitation in process and lots of flexibility. But finally, what if it's Willowbank, a school, a place, an attitude? Well, that sounds familiar to some of us, doesn't it? So what would we do? Maybe, perish the thought, or maybe provocatively, what is a house that accommodated a large family needs to change to have the larger spaces to accommodate an educational institution. And maybe this floor gets removed, so this is a 2-story space with a teaching gallery. The walls are exposed to see the guts of them to show as an illustrative tool, and we have a completely different approach. You enter this room maybe at a balcony here, a balcony there, but really down at the main level, because then you're looking up and you're understanding the sense of verticality that this house has and not just the horizontality. The exposed walls are telling you the story of how the fireplace is held up on the first floor as well as the magnificent mantel on the second floor. That would never get funded in the United States. You'd never get tax credits. But who does Willowbank answer to? It answers to the future and its students. So maybe we sort of deconstruct this place in a heretical way if we can find funders and get the Ontario Heritage Trust to approve it. But finally, going back to technology and heritage conservation are thought to be two completely different things, because many of us have only just learned to type on a computer. My mother still doesn't know how to use the internet. The little old blue-haired lady, she's not, but she was of that generation that created at the bicentennial this sense that America has something that's worth preserving, and has driven the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the 1966 Act, and the others. Can we bring in students who can work with Willowbank students to create holograms, so that you step into this space and you flip a switch and you are virtual reality of the Bright parlor as the Bright family experienced it. You turn the dial, or you change your glasses, and you are in the Hamilton house. And you are in the Hamilton house just after Mr. Hamilton dies, and his wife takes it over with 9 children, Elizabeth, to 10 children, to keep it alive. To me, that's the most important hidden story. How that woman kept this place alive when a woman couldn't own property, when a woman couldn't have a job. She took in laundry, she grew her own vegetables. That's the story. Can we have hologram figures of that time in this space with our virtual reality glasses? To my mind, this is the great frontier, that people who come here to learn how to work with their hands and their minds begin to use technology to create an interpretive center that is the center of the universe. Jaron Lanier, whom I have met, said to architects who were actually paying him to say this at a conference, virtual reality is going to give people the ability to do whatever they want to do to design their environment. And they're not going to have any idea how to do it. They're going to need architects to help them figure it out. I think that's not so far off as his virtual reality of 25 years ago becomes the current reality for our 25-year-olds. That we at Willowbank and in this room have the opportunity to use this technology to tell the story of this significant place, from the Aboriginal people who lived on the site to those of us who will be graduating in coming years. And that, to my mind, is how we get out from under the constraints in America of protecting or preserving ancient forms and get into the opportunity to pass on to future generations the story about how we got here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Clinton, very much. That matrix is really interesting. I might actually leave that up for the debate just so we can, it's kind of a good idea. Okay, and last but not least, Spencer Higgins. Mr. Higgins is the principal of Spencer R. Higgins Architect Incorporated, which is based in Toronto, and he's been there since 1980, I guess, or roughly. He obtained a Certificate of Architectural Conservation in 1980 from the International Center for the Study of Preservation and the Restoration of Cultural Property in Rome, following a Master's of Architecture and Urban Design at Harvard University in 1976 and a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Toronto in 1974. Mr. Higgins' firm has carried out numerous conservation projects across Canada, most recently the Saskatchewan Legislative Building. From 1996 to 2006, Mr. Higgins was a partner in the architectural joint venture that undertook the internationally award-winning conservation work on the Library of Parliament in Ottawa. So, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. See what I can.
It's not PowerPoint. I think it's on the screen. I'm not sure how to do it. Do you know how to make it? Yeah, it's a PDF. Maybe go on the screen.
You should just be able to open it.
Yeah, I'm gonna try. I don't know how to change the view on the screen.
Frank, maybe you can- No? The only thing I think is also look at your displays to see